and welcome to the program. This is Vivica Williams, and you're watching Head to Head. The Minsk Agreement, much misunderstood and seemingly always ignored. So what exactly does Russia need to do to make it work? Well, today we're talking about exactly that with Paul Niland, a political commentator here in Ukraine. Paul, thanks for being with me today.
Thank you for inviting me back.
All right. So it's been quite a while. What we want to talk about today is the Minsk Agreement, and I know you've written quite a lot about this, and it's so oftenly misunderstood, and as we see, it's not been put into, it's not working.
It's not working. That's a fact. And yes, a lot is talked about Minsk, and the reason for the last article that I just wrote is that I was seeing various different comments where they were saying the Minsk ceasefire. Minsk is not just about a ceasefire. The ceasefire is one element of Minsk, and it's the first element, and it's the first element of any peace agreement that you find anywhere. Right. But Minsk is much larger than that. Minsk is actually a process. It's a framework by which Ukraine is supposed to regain sovereignty over the areas of Ukraine that are currently occupied.
And it's often talked about just ending the war, and it's not about ending the war. It's about returning this territory to Ukraine.
Exactly.
Right. So let's talk about the ideas of the ceasefire and this first component, the ceasefire and the pullback, all the things that go with that, pullback of heavy weapons. So what does Russia need to do in this regard?
The first thing that Russia needs to do is it needs to give an order to the troops that they control within Ukraine, inside of Ukrainian territory, to stop fighting. And I mean, it's really that simple. And we know for a fact that the troops that are fighting in and against Ukraine are controlled by the Kremlin. We know for a fact that the structure that the military structure and also the political structure as well of the so-called DNR and LNR, the entities that were created by the Kremlin to attempt to seize that territory away from Ukraine. We know that they are following orders from Russia, and it is Russia that simply must give them an order to stop. And you know what Vladimir Putin has done in Ukraine by creating this war is he's also created a massive problem for Russia and for Russian citizens, because as a result of the war, Russia has seen very heavy sanctions imposed against them, and the sanctions are due to be rolled over now by the European Union, and further sanctions were put in place recently by the American Congress and Senate, and that furthered things. But you know, what people in Russia must understand is they must understand that it is the actions of their leadership that are causing them economic hardship. It is the actions of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine and in other places as well that is actually making Russia a pariah state. And Russia actually is a great country. I'm not at all a Russophobe. I think that Russia's a fabulous place, and there are many Russian friends who live here in Ukraine. I had a business meeting last week with a lady, and she was saying to me that she's only been here in Kiev for 2 years, and I said, "Where are you from?" And she said, "I'm from Russia." And I thought,
so it's not, it comes back to the problems with the government being able to say directly, and this is something we see though when we talk about pulling back of Russian troops. Everyone knows that Russian troops are there. Yes. But they continue with this. They're lost. Russian troops are, if they're there, they've gotten lost. Or
they're volunteers, or they're on holiday, or whatever it is. But the problem isn't just the Russian troops. And one of the things that I outlined in this article, and the information came from the office of the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, it's the heavy military equipment that is inside of Ukrainian territory. And according to Ukrainian estimates, there are 680 tanks inside of Ukraine.
And of course, they say this is captured. I mean, we have Putin recently saying that so much of this armament has been captured or somehow acquired by the militants there. So when does this facade end, and how can it be ended? I know I'm putting a lot on you to have some kind of idea to an answer.
Well, the first thing that needs to happen is people need. When I say people, I'm talking about people who are reporting on the contract, the conflict, and people who are in high-level diplomatic circles. We need to call a spade a spade. We need to say that this is obviously Russian aggression, and we need to point out that, you know, it's absurd. When Vladimir Putin or Dmitry Peskov or Sergei Lavrov or whoever it is trying to make excuses and say this stuff could have been pulled out from a mine, right? I mean, that was one of the things that was recently claimed, that you know, it's Soviet-era equipment that had been stored in mines, or that, you know, it's been purchased from a military hardware store or something like that. There is no way. There is no way. And if you pull up a map of the affected area, the conflict, there is 450 kilometers of Ukrainian-Russian border that is open, across which all of this material is obviously pouring. And it's not just the 680 tanks. There's 1,170 pieces of artillery and multiple rocket launchers, 1,250 armored fighting vehicles.
This obviously didn't come out of a mine.
It hasn't come out of a mine.
So so it comes down to there needs to be some really direct conversation. Not even conversation. There needs to be really direct interaction with Russia, with saying, this is the case. These are weaponry. You have troops there.
Yep.
Right. And before then, so you're thinking before, but how is that possible? We're in a situation we see where this would not allow them to save face. I mean, I know everyone says you can't. We have to allow some way for them to save face. I wouldn't say exactly, but to be able to pull back. Yes, Putin can give that, pull back troops now, right, without admitting that there are troops there?
Well, I don't think they'll ever admit that there are troops there and Russian military equipment there. But over the 3.5 years of this conflict now, Vladimir Putin has had many opportunities to save face, and he hasn't taken them because what's going on in Ukraine right now will fundamentally affect the entire post-Soviet space, I believe. The revolution that took place here from November of 2013 until January of 2014, it was good, decent, honest people who stood up and said, we're fed up of corruption. We want a democratic system. We want accountability from our elected leaders. And that, to Vladimir Putin and the clan around him, that's a serious challenge. That's a major challenge. But the other thing that we have to look at, and I don't care if Vladimir Putin saves face.
Well, exactly. And as you said, there's been 3 years of giving this opportunity to do that. So at this point, if we're looking at to have success for the Minsk agreement, not ceasefire, then there needs to be...
What needs to happen is precisely that there needs to be an order to ceasefire. There needs to be a withdrawal of all of this military equipment. But the other point that I was trying to make with the article that I had published yesterday is that Minsk isn't a buffet. It's not something where you can come along and you pick and choose, I want a piece of this, and I want a piece of this, and I want a piece of this, because there are lots of other elements of Minsk that are being ignored by Russia. And one of the examples is that there should have been a release of all illegally held persons, of all hostages. And that simply has not happened. The other important thing as well, and I mean, if we talk about the military hardware that is inside of Ukraine, somehow that's being resupplied as well. And one of the points of Minsk is that the provision of humanitarian aid should come via an international mechanism. So it should be organizations such as the Red Cross and others who are responsible for dealing with this man-made humanitarian problem that we have there. But what Russia's doing is they're unilaterally sending in convoys of white trucks that they call humanitarian aid, but nobody looks at them, nobody inspects them.
Well, and there has been times when journalists have inspected them, have taken photos, and showed that this is not humanitarian aid, or this is very, have empty trucks. So it's obviously a facade. It's obviously a facade.
It's clearly a facade, and I think it was the very first convoy that they sent across the border. They allowed some journalists to take a look at it, and most of the trucks were half empty. And at the time, I remember doing some maths, and I forget exactly what the figures were, but the stated volume of aid that Russia claimed that they were sending in would have filled something like 45 trucks. And in actual fact, they sent 130, right? And this is now 68 times that Russia has sent a convoy of vehicles across the internationally recognized Ukrainian border. That's not allowed by Minsk. It's not allowed by any norms of the way that countries interact.
So how is this allowed to continue? We know that Ukraine does not have control over this part of the border. And so how does the international community allow this to continue? How is this overlooked as being allowed as humanitarian aid?
I'm not sure that it's overlooked, but what Russia has very successfully done is they've exploited ambiguity in the media, and they've exploited the diplomatic tendency and norms to speak in roundabout language, and the condemnation of Russia's actions has not been strong enough, and this is one of the things that now needs to happen. It's not just about sanctions; it's about a very public international coalition reaction to Russia's actions by telling them, here are all the things that you must not do.
And so with the humanitarian aid, this has to be specifically set out. I'm not sure if I've actually really heard that this, if you want to send humanitarian aid, it must be through these routes. Right.
It says they're directly in Minsk. It's point 7 of Minsk, that all the humanitarian aid should be distributed via international mechanisms.
And yet we see that it hasn't. So this is one thing. We have these points about the ceasefire, about the humanitarian aid. Let's talk briefly about OSCE. Now, this is a big issue as well, with the right of OSCE monitoring mission to access areas.
The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission has an exceptionally difficult job to do, and one of the things that complicates their work is the fact that the OSCE must work on a basis of unanimity of all members, and Russia is a member of the OSCE. So anything that comes out of the OSCE has, in essence, been vetted by Russia. And also we have Russian people who are a part of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, which many people have said in the past, as Russia is a party to the conflict, that should not happen. There's a precedent for that as well, and the precedent was in the Balkan War, when then Yugoslavia was clearly a party to the inter-ethnic conflicts that were going on there. And so the OSCE decided to operate on a system of unanimity -1. So they told one of the members, you're no longer a part of the decision-making process here. But I mean, the OSCE are an unarmed mission. They're there to observe and they're there to report, and they do an exceptionally good job of doing that in difficult circumstances. We know that an American citizen, Mr. Joseph Stone, was sadly killed by a landmine, an IED, that the vehicle that he was traveling in drove over. But the biggest thing that hampers the work of the OSCE is that they're not being given free access to the areas that are currently controlled by Russia's proxies. And again, in Minsk, it says that the OSCE must have full access to be able to monitor however they want. And that includes using drones, for example, that go up and look at different artillery positions. And the drones are getting shot down. You know, these are the things that must stop. The international community, with an absolute steadfast determination, must tell Russia, these actions are not acceptable. You must stop it.
And the problem is we have 3 years of this, and I'm not sure what changes can happen here. We see with Russia doing as it wishes, with flaunting the demands of the international community. And here we have that issue going on in Ukraine with the Minsk agreements.
But you're asking how do we change this? What changes this? And you know, I don't have all of the answers.
If you did have the answers, this would be great. Things would be easier to solve.
If I had the answer, then you know there would be 10,000 people who would be still alive today.
Well, and so we look at how to change, how to go forward. We know that meeting these agreements is required. Let's talk briefly about the issue with hostages. So I know that the trilateral group is looking at considering an exchange of hostages. I think it's a couple, like 300 people who've been captured from the militants for about 67, I believe, soldiers. So this is something that the trilateral group is putting forward, possibly doing. What else needs to be done, and what do you think about this way of exchanging the hostages?
Well, what else needs to be done is that there needs to be a demand put to Russia that they meet all of the separate aspects of Minsk, not just to sit back and to talk about, you know, there's a ceasefire that has again failed. Okay, so there was a ceasefire that was recently announced because children were returning to school on the 1st of September. So we had this back-to-school ceasefire, and then the next day you're seeing reports of 36 attacks or 24 attacks on Ukrainian positions from Russian artillery.
And so in the case with hostages, it's the same type of thing, not a piecemeal type of issue is what you're
Exactly. It's not a piecemeal, and Minsk should be taken as an overall agreement, and all of the individual aspects of Minsk must be fulfilled. If we go back to the question of how do we change the situation, how do we change Russia's approach, there are actions that can be taken. People have talked about expanding sanctions. People have talked about taking the list of Russian-sanctioned individuals and expanding that to include their families as well. You know, some people would say that's harsh. But at the end of the day, if the people who are connected to the regime that sits inside the Kremlin, if their wives are not able to go shopping in Harrods, if they're not able to fly to Switzerland to go and have their teeth whitened, or whatever, and that's real.
There needs to be personal.
Happens,
I mean, there
right?
needs to be. It is obvious. Often with sanctions, that the sanctions hurt the common people of countries that don't necessarily give much voice or care much about what the common people think.
But taking the current sanctions list, or the current list of sanctioned individuals, and expanding that to their families, you're not hurting the common people.
You're actually maybe perhaps doing more to hurting people who they actually care about and would actually respond to.
Exactly right. And maybe that's something that could come up with some kind of response. It's long been talked about as well that one option could be to cut Russia off from the SWIFT international banking system as well. There are many options that are open, as the United States has just proved, in actual fact, by expanding their sanctions against Russia. There are many options that are open, and if you're going to borrow a phrase from Donald Trump, all options are on the table, right? Anything is possible, and what we need to do is we need to recognize what's happening, and we need to say that there must be an immediate response to this now, because it's 3.5 years. 10,000 people have been killed at least.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being with us today, Paul.
Thanks again.
All right, thank you. Today we were speaking with Paul Niland, a political commentator here in Kyiv. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great day.